Hello and welcome to my quick start guide for SurgeXT, the free powerhouse synthesizer that you may have never used just because the interface is a little bit daunting and confusing. All you need is a basic understanding of synthesis, oscillators, filters, modulators, and you can very easily work with this synth. But when you first bring it in and you look at it, it's a little bit like, how exactly does this thing work? And that's the reason for this quick start guide. So I'll get you up and running with this instrument in as short of time as possible so that you can start experimenting and creating your own sounds. So when you first bring in Surge, the first thing you might want to do is change the skin to Surge Dark. It just looks a little bit better to my eye, but you can obviously leave it on Classic if you want. And then you also have a lot of different zoom options, and you can select them from here. You can also go in and select your zoom options from here, but it's just as easy to drag and pull out the interface to get it to the size that you want. You'll notice when I clicked on zoom there was this little question mark in zoom at the top. One of the really cool things inside of Surge is that if you right click on virtually any parameter in the instrument, you'll find that there's a question mark with a title. And by clicking that, it will take you to the manual where then you can really read up on the details of whatever that particular parameter is. So once you get through this quick start guide, using that will be a great help to you. The patch browser is pretty self-explanatory. We have three different columns: factory, third party, and user. So if we select something here, we can jump around to other bases inside of the factory. And then we could also change categories and jump to other brass sounds inside of the factory. Once you get into a third party, so let's go into this third party one here. As I'm jumping around, it's going to keep it inside of that third-party bank. I can go in and I can favorite things, and once I favorite a preset, we will see that appear there in user patches. And likewise, once I start to go and save my own patches, I'll be able to give them a category, and then they'll show up there in user patches. Whenever you need to initialize the instrument, you can just come up and initialize the patch. You can also save a different default patch for the instrument. If you want to like set up reverb, delay, or like a limiter and EQ in the global effects, you could do that, but we're just going to stick with this initialize saw. Now, all synths are pretty much the same and they're broken up the same way. You have your sound generators. In this case, it's a very fancy hybrid oscillator, of which we have access to 3. Then you have your shapers, things like FM, feedback on the filters, and then your actual filters. And we have 2 of those filters here built into Surge, lots of different modes for the filters to experiment and explore with. And then we have our envelopes and our modulators. So we have our filter envelope, we have our amplitude envelope, and then we have tons of other options. And you can see that with these, they're very fancy and they have a lot of different options built into them. Additionally, what kind of sets Surge apart from a lot of other instruments are all of the effects and the effects routing you can do. So we have here insert effects, send effects, and then global effects. So why global effects? That's because we have an A and a B scene. And that's something you've probably seen in other instruments like Synth, where you can basically have 2 versions of Surge running and make changes to each. And then you have different ways of combining them or splitting them out. So key split, one patch plays below C4, the other patch plays above C4. You also have the channel split, which we're not going to go into. And then we have dual. So dual would be the true combination all into one patch, where you'll have to mix that with the volume knob here per scene. So you can see how that's changing. Let's bring in a preset that will show that off. We can go to lead, and this one here that says dual on it. So let's actually change this back to single, and then we'll go to that preset so that we can see it change to dual. Boom. And then we can see the differences here. So let's take a listen. And let's move A all the way into the left. And let's take B and let's move that all the way into the right. And let's change the pitch of B. So you could imagine just how powerful that would be. And on top of that, you could add different insert effects to A versus to B. So you can really get deep and wild with this instrument if you want to do it. Coming back to our initialized patch, let's just make something really basic and simple so that we can demonstrate the flow of this instrument. So here we have a sawtooth wave. We can change its shape. We can add in some sub, tiny bit of syncing, and then we can also change the width of various parts of this. Now, again, this is always experimentation. Sometimes these parameters will play a big role, sometimes they won't. So that's what we're going to start with. And then let's go ahead and add on some voices. Let's add 4 voices and detune them. So there's our starting point right there. What if we want to go in and we want to do a little bit of filtering? Let's go ahead and let's choose a low pass here. Add a little resonance. Now we want to have some movement. Let's go ahead and let's add some of that down here in the filter envelope generator. Let's match the release. And there we kind of have our first little sound already created. If we want to go in and add some kind of like modulation to something, let's say we want to put something on the mod wheel, like the pitch. I can click on the mod wheel, I'll click on it again, and then you'll see that it goes green. This will now allow me to set the amount that I want to put on. And we can hear that like so. Now, there's a lot of different ways to apply modulation. I could also, for example, let's put like, I don't know, an LFO onto the cutoff. If I want to, I could drag and drop it on here, and then it's going to tell me to set the range. So that's a little bit trickier, but like, you know, I could set this to be, oh my gosh, it's in hertz. See, this is why I wouldn't want to do this. We're not even hearing anything at all. So I would more likely go in here and do that way. For finer tune control over your sources and destinations, you can go into list and then you can make edits and adjustments here. We can see our LFO is kind of moving in a bipolar way because it's going above and below, you know, a certain axis. But then for something like mod wheel, it's just going in one direction, because the mod wheel only moves in one direction. So that is the way that you would go in here and edit it. You can even pop this out if you have a big enough kind of display, and you could have your instrument over on the left and you could be playing around with your modulations on the right if you wanted to do that. Now we'll go into the part that tends to trip people up with this instrument, which is the mixer and the filter configuration. So here in the mixer, you can see that the only thing that's playing is oscillator 1, and that's just playing like a sawtooth wave. If I mute that, we won't hear anything. But in scene B, we will. And just remember that scene B is like completely independent of scene A. You can create a totally different sound in there. So going back to scene A here, we have our oscillator, and then we have this thing called ring. Now, if I unmute ring, this is now going to be the ring modulation result of 1 and 2. You don't need to worry about what that means, what that does. I'm sure you can probably like right click on here and learn about ring modulation, but we're going to hear a sound now, even though all of the oscillators are muted, right? So if I go into oscillator 2 and I start to change things, we're going to hear something coming out, right? And that's the ring modulation. So let's just go back to 1. And then go over this filter configuration. One thing that's nice in Bitwig, it's probably true in other DAWs, is that you can go and you can see sometimes what the actual parameter is if it doesn't make sense in here. So like we have S meaning serial and D meaning dual, and then we have a stereo filter configuration, a ring configuration, and then we have wide. So by default, it comes in as wide, which will allow for us to have stereo sounds just right out of the gate. So when we do unison detune, we're able to get a stereo sound. If I was to go in here to S1, serial 1, you can see there's only one pathway. This is now going to be a mono sound. And the way this is working and what it's diagramming is it's saying the sound is going to come in. Really, it would go through this FM first, but the sound is coming into filter 1 first. So let's add like a low pass. Then it's going into the wave shaper, which is down here. So let's pick something for the wave shaper. And then it's going to go into filter 2. So let's pick something for filter 2. Let's open it up a little more. Or I can even change the balance and push it more towards filter 2. Okay, then it's going into the amplitude envelope. So we can hear that. And then it's going into a final high pass, which is over here if you're trying to eliminate some subsonics. And then we're going to our actual output. Okay, you'll notice that width has gone away. We can still pan things. And our effects can still be stereo. So we could go into A here and we could add on like a chorus. And that will still provide us with some stereo width once we get into that section. So let's go back into these filter configurations. When you're messing around with the serial configurations, remember that it's basically just one path of audio. So whatever happens with filter 1 is ultimately then impacting filter 2 and what you can do with it. When you go to dual, it basically is having two different paths, two separate paths for this oscillator to go to. So whatever you do with filter 1 is not impacting filter 2. They're separate, and then they get added together with the filter balance before going into the wave shaper, through the amplitude envelope, through the high pass filter. So I'll just give you a very quick example of that. If I go in here and I take the filter balance and put it all the way to the left, and then I go in and I choose a low pass, we can hear that impact. If I take the filter balance and go all the way to the right, and then I choose, let's do one of these wild ones, I can hear that like so. Now when I come and I balance these, we can hear the resulting sound of that oscillator being split out into two paths. If I come to S2, for example, I can still get it to a point where it's only paying attention to F2, but you can hear in the middle how this is paying attention to what's happened there, and we're getting almost no result at all in comparison there to the dual mode. We also have a left and a right mode. This is considered like the stereo mode. And now here is where using this parameter is going to come into play. So you can send an oscillator specifically into either filter 1 or filter 2. And that might be useful for us here in this example. So here we have our first oscillator. All right, we can hear that like so. And let's send it now just into filter 1. All right, and we can hear where that's falling in the panning. And now let's go ahead and let's grab number 2 and do something similar. All right, very different sound, as you can hear. And I'm now just going to send this one over into filter 2. So we can now hear just how like wild and stereo-y that is. It's like a hard pan left and a hard pan right. We then do have additional control here over the width if we want to try to bring this back a little. We can do that like so. Very cool. One other thing you may have noticed is that when you bring on filters, like let's bring on this legacy ladder, you'll see sometimes this little option here. And with this option, you can actually then change the mode of the filter. So in this case, with the legacy ladder, we're looking at the 6 dB version, the 12 dB version, the 18, and then the 24. Sometimes you'll get some really interesting things. Like here's this LP K35, no saturation, mild saturation, and moderate saturation. So it's something to definitely experiment with and look at, but just realize that there's sometimes even more modes for the filter than just what you're seeing when you first look at this menu here. Moving right along, we have some of our standard things you expect to see in a synthesizer, like we have our pitch bend. And you can then set the range of that here with the up and down. That's very self-explanatory. And we also then have our different playback modes. So right now we're poly. You can set the maximum number of notes to be pressed up here. Then we also have our different mono modes. I'm not even going to go over these. These are things that you can, right click and learn about. Very easy to work with though. In our case, these aren't going to have much of an impact because we don't have any filter cutoff movement or anything like that happening. We have an oscillator drift. So once I bring on a second oscillator, we can do that whole thing right there. And then we also have noise. So let's bring in a little bit of noise. And then we can change the color of it, either darker or brighter. We can change the entire pitch of the scene up octaves or down octaves, or more of a fine-tune deal. And then we also have our portamento when we're doing like mono type stuff. So let's set this to even longer. And so some of these will have an impact on how that portamento responds and reacts. So I'll leave it to you to look up that. Let's go down here and look at our modulators. So we have some macro knobs like you've seen in probably other DAWs and other synthesizers. So if you want to set this up, you have a few options. You can drag and drop it and then kind of type in a value yourself. Like we could say 6 semitones. And we can see that moving like so. The more common way to do this and the easier way to do it is if you just click on it again, you can then see the range of it with this green slider here. And for things like LFO, you'll see it moving bipolar, but for things that are just, one direction, you'll just have it go one direction like this. And then you can go in here and you can also rename these things. So you don't need to just have it be called pitch. You could call it just like M1 if you wanted to do that. So everything here at the top, all these macros are just going to be, kind of that one knob thing. And then everything that does not have a little icon next to it is also just preset. So you have stuff like the mod wheel, the pitch bend, channel aftertouch, poly aftertouch, release velocity, expression, sustain, timbre, all these things that you're probably already familiar with other instruments. And then what you have are the ones that are a little bit more unique and fun to play with. So here, if I click on LFO1 or LFO2, I have all of these different modes that I can set up. So it doesn't just have to be an LFO. For now, it is just an LFO, and we'll put this onto the cutoff. All right, that's pretty much what you're expecting. But then we also can go in and change this to different things. So we could change it to something like an MSG. Put it into unipolar so we can really hear it. I'm going to change this a little bit here, get it a little more interesting for us. And there's all sorts of things that you can play with down here and mess around with and learn. If you were to right click and then to go on to, LFO type, it's going to give you explanations of what all of these things do. So I'll leave it up to you to really experiment with these. But there's a ton that you can do, and you can see that there's lots of presets that we could use as well. But what will be the most useful is to right click and probably learn more about all of these different shapes and everything that you can do within the instrument. Let's just go over some of the other unique things quickly. We have this character option, neutral, warm, bright. So right now we probably won't hear much of a difference. If I click bright, we'll probably see something change. Yep, you can see it's brought on those peaks. And you actually can hear a difference even just with the saw wave. So basically what it's doing, nothing super fancy, but with the oscillators, when you're on bright, it's going to enhance the stuff going on in the higher harmonics. When you're on warm, it's going to, kind of de-emphasize those, and then neutral just is what it is. So you can experiment with that depending on the sound that you're working with. You may or may not have a use for it. We also have these different options inside of our envelope generators, and you can see if we look down in Bitwig, when I pull this, we can see the different options. So for release, we can either use linear, quadratic, cubic. You can do the same things with the decay and with the attack. Analog, it just is what it is. So again, it's up to you to experiment with those, see if it's going to make a difference to your sound and what you're going for. Sometimes it will. Sometimes you will kind of want to use digital to change things if you're going for a pluck versus going for more of a pad. Having those ramps can be useful. And then finally, we can get to the effects. So we have our inserts, our sends, and then our global. So we have a path and we have a B path. So right now we're just again going to focus on A. So here's our sound for now. Let's add some voices and just change a little bit. It's a nice little sound right there. So let's add something to it. You can see we have our insert effect 1, and I'll go down here to Neuron and choose this cassette maybe. There's lots and lots of options. If I double click on it, it will bypass it. I can also bypass from up here with just our sends or our sends and global or everything. So right now, if I hit this on send, it's gonna have no difference. Send and global, no difference, all. There you go, you can hear the difference. I added on one more effect. And now we can set up a little send effect here. Let's send up a reverb. So reverb 1, I'll just use reverb 1 and wormhole. Okay, so luckily by default here, it actually did not set the mix to 100%. So I'm gonna make sure I do that. And now I'll have to start to send some in. That is not the best sounding reverb in the world, but you get the idea. Now notice we only have options for effects 1 and effects 2 slot. If you want to get to 3 and 4, you actually have to go in and click it, and then you can send into 3 and 4. So let's on number 3, let's just set up some kind of a delay. Good, okay, this time the mix is set to 100. And then we have it like so. And then finally, we have our global effects. So let's go in here to a global effect, and you can see that we have Air Windows built into this. So let's take something from Air Windows. Something like this. And then we also have things like limiters. Let's use the peak suppressor. And then maybe we'll also just use a little bit of filtering here. And let's send it in. Nice, and then we'll use our wave shaper. Find something wild. Nice. here's the end result. So there's so much more you can do with this instrument. We've really just scratched the surface, especially as it relates to the various oscillator modes, the FM routing, which we didn't set up at all. And then of course, with these modulators, there is so much more you can do, but I hope that this has given you a good little quick start into using SurgeXT.